Yo, what's up guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to the European Union versus the United States, EU versus USA. Who would win army military comparison? I mean, I'm almost certain going into this that it would be the US because I think, for example, if it wasn't for NATO, the EU would be screwed because like Russia would I don't know, just outstrength Europe on its own. I'm pretty sure. So yeah, if Russia could, then the US definitely could. But obviously, luckily and thankfully, this isn't the case. This is just a comparison to see what would happen. I don't know if this is also made before or after the UK left the EU. Because if it was after, then it makes sense because the United States would see like, oh, the UK left. So it's like, now we can take our chance to take over the EU or whatever. But because the UK may have still been there, they didn't want to do it because, you know, we're so powerful. I'm joking, by the way. But we're going to check this out and see. I know the EU is powerful. Like, in the grand scheme of things, it has some of the strongest armies in the world, but it just shows the real strength of the US if it really is that much stronger. But we're gonna see. Maybe there's aspects the EU stronger, maybe on land because it's connected to Asia by land and I guess Africa by land in a sense as well. Obviously, you have to go through Asia to Africa, but it's a lot of land-based war and stuff. So maybe in terms of like tanks and things like that, it will be stronger. But I assume in every other aspect it won't. Maybe in terms of troops as well. But we'll see and learn about which would be stronger. This is 2017 as well, so it may be a little bit outdated. But yeah, links are also in the description to my Patreon if you want to see some more of my reactions. But let's just check this out.
The world watched in wonder when in 1993 the European Union was officially formed. Questions abounded. Would the UK and France finally be able to live harmoniously in perpetuity? Would Germany and the rest of Europe finally form an unbreakable alliance? With a currency to rival that of the US and the combined military might of 28 different countries, the EU could easily be one of America's greatest trading partners or one of its most menacing foes. Although the American and European alliance is the strongest today than it's ever been, we thought it would be interesting to compare the military might of these two powerhouses and determine who would most likely win in a theoretical war in this episode of the infographic show, The European Union versus the United States of America.
Here we go.
Although money isn't everything, the first major difference worth pointing out is military spending.
It is kind of crazy how we're comparing not a continent in a sense because it's not the whole continent, but half a continent and some of the most powerful countries from that continent to an entire country. So you would hope in this sort of stuff it would be winning, but it's not. It is kind of wild.
The annual defense budget of the European Union, which still includes the UK, even though they recently voted to Brexit.
Okay, so it is before the UK left.
Is $227 billion, or 3 times smaller than the United States.
Wow.
It's his annual defense budget of $664 billion.
Wow.
When it comes to manpower, the EU has a population of 743 million people, with 1.4 million being active military personnel and 1.7 million being reserve personnel. The United States has a population of 324 million people, with 1.4 million being active military personnel and 1.1 million being reserve personnel.
God damn, it's really comparable. Other than population, it's less than half the population, but it's the same. Flipping hell.
With programs such as Sabre Strike, the 7th Army Training Command, and the Atlantic Resolve, it is safe to assume that the close connection between the US and the EU has resulted in reasonably similar.
Why is there such a baddie there? that's no flipping soldier. Flipping hell.
Training for the army personnel of each country. In terms of land systems, the EU and the US are also similarly matched. The EU has 6,700 tanks, 48,971 AFVs, 2,312 SPGs, 3,492 towed artillery, and 1,069 MLRSs. The US, on the other hand, has a fleet of 8,848.
Wait, it has more tanks. Oh my god, okay. If they're winning on the land, then yeah, they're dominating.
Tanks, 41,000 AFVs, 1,934 SPGs, 1,300 towed artillery, and 1,331
So it's 2 for the US, 3 for the EU. Crazy to think that it's that close, but the tanks is a lot more in the US.
MLRSs. Despite the US having a larger number of ground tanks, Germany makes one of the top ranked tanks, the Leopard 2, which has been purchased in the hundreds by countries all over Europe. It should be noted that while the US has troops and missiles stationed in Europe, there are no European army bases in the US. This is an obvious advantage to the US, who could more easily bring the battle to European soil, keeping it away from the plants which manufacture American weapons, and again turning Europe into a war zone similar to World War II. Of the US missiles on European soil, the Aegis Ashore missile defense system located in Romania has recently gone online and is manned by 130 US sailors. This defense system is currently run by NATO, but in the case of a US-EU war, it would become an ideal base for the US on European soil. With regard to air power, the US currently has a larger and more modern air force with 13,444 aircraft, the most popular being the American-made F-16 Fighting Falcon. The EU has less than half that, with 6,751 total aircraft, the most popular being the Eurofighter Typhoon. Since the US and the European Union are on two different continents, it's important to take a look at each country's naval power. The EU has a total of 61 submarines, 102 frigates, 21 destroyers, 39 corvettes, 167 mine warfare craft, and 210 patrol craft. The United States, on the other hand, has 75 submarines, 6 frigates, 62 destroyers, 0 corvettes, 11 mine warfare craft, and 13 patrol.
You can kind of see with some of these, like frigates is a lot more in the EU than destroyers is a lot more in the US. Corvettes is a lot more in the EU. Mine warfare, there's a lot more. I guess sometimes they compensate because they do work together. Like the US will probably see, maybe the EU will see that they have less in this, and then they'll build more of that. It's probably conversations of them not building a certain amount of things because there's so many in the EU or there's so many in the US, if that makes any sense. I guess that is kind of what happens with certain aspects, because even with the last comparisons, it was kind of similar in terms of not the plane one, not the air naval, the land systems. Just go here quickly. So I mean, total artillery, there's a lot less in the US, there's a lot more in the EU. Maybe that's the thing. I might be waffling, to be honest, but I feel like that's a possibility.
6 frigates, 62 destroyers, 0 corvettes, 11 mine warfare craft, and 13 patrol craft. The two seem pretty tied, however the EU only has 8 aircraft carriers compared to the US's 19. In
19?
the unlikely scenario that nuclear weapons are used, the US has a stockpile of 6,800 nuclear warheads, with 150 nuclear warheads located directly in Europe. Europe barely has 500 nuclear warheads of its own, split nearly evenly between the UK and France. As we all know, a major component of this military assessment is fuel, since almost every ground vehicle, aircraft, and naval unit needs fuel in order to operate. The European Union produces only 1.7 million barrels of oil a day and consumes almost 8 times that each day. It also has 5.6 billion barrels of oil in reserve. The United States produces 9 million barrels of oil a day and consumes 19 million barrels daily, though it has 37 billion barrels of oil in reserve.
Okay, the EU screwed in this aspect for sure.
It is safe to say both countries
Also, the oil in reserve has definitely gone down for both countries here.
would need to rely on importing oil from other countries. The EU and the US share most of their allies, and it would be very interesting to see who allies with whom. As many will point out, experience is also a major factor when assessing military prowess. The EU and the US have been involved in the same wars for the last decade. However, the US military exists as a unified entity, and the EU runs much of their military on a country-by-country basis, making communication and tactical planning much more complicated. When it comes to the all-seeing eyes from space, both the European Union and the United States run their own global navigation satellite systems. The US has GPS and the EU has Galileo. GPS used to have the capability to block civilian signals called selective availability. One of the main reasons the EU developed Galileo was due to its concern that the US could deny others access to GPS during political disagreements. The two came to a compromise, and the US is now in the process of replacing old GPS satellites with new ones that will not have selective availability enabled. So, who do you think would win the war?
It's pretty obvious who would win. But it was just interesting to see the comparison. America, you killed my father. Europe, nor was I. I am your father. America, no, that's impossible. Much love, Europe, from the United States. Europeans and Americans are great friends, and let's keep it that way. EU love from the USA. An army is nothing without a good general, Napoleon. This would never happen, but if it did, everyone would lose. I'm glad the US and Europe. Yeah, hopefully this never happens. You know what? This is one of those things you don't want to happen. And I assume won't happen. Unless some crazy stuff comes to play. I don't know. like the EU meddling with the US is whatever, or vice versa, then yeah, I'm sure it'll stay the same way. But it's an interesting look into how it would be, and yeah, let me know your thoughts. And until next time, like, subscribe.